Good afternoon. On behalf of the GMC Board of Trustees, members of the 143rd Corps of Cadets, faculty and staff at Georgia Military College, I would like to welcome you to our ceremony honoring the legacy of Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. I am Cadet Shelby Griffin, and I will be your narrator for this event. Georgia Military College extends a special welcome to the guests and dignitaries who have joined Lieutenant General and Miss Caldwell on this historic day. We would like to recognize the members of our GMC Board of Trustees, Chairman George Hogan, our Baldwin County Commissioners, Chairman Henry Craig, members of the GMC Foundation, and Mr. Al Jackson, a 1967 graduate of the GMC Junior College and the first African American to graduate from the Junior College Corps of Cadets. Allow me to provide a brief history of Martin Luther King Day. It was officially observed as a national public holiday for the first time in 1986. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia. His father served as pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, a church that had been founded by Martin Luther King Jr.'s maternal grandfather. He attended local public schools in Atlanta, where he excelled. He entered nearby Morehouse College at age 15 and graduated with a bachelor's degree in sociology in 1948. Martin Luther King Jr. was ordained as a Baptist minister at age 18. After graduating with honors from Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania in 1951, he attended Boston University and earned a doctoral degree in systematic theology in 1955. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered as one of the principal leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement and as a prominent advocate for nonviolent protest. Dr. King's nonviolent challenges to segregation and racial discrimination in the 1950s and 60s helped convince many Americans to support the cause of civil rights in the United States. He was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Even before he was assassinated in 1968, Dr. King was a worldwide symbol for the struggle towards universal racial equality and a symbol of hope for the oppressed. He was, in the fullest sense of the words, a good man, and we honor his memory today with this ceremony. Dr. King once said, "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" The Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service is a part of the President's national call to service that calls for Americans from all walks of life to work together to provide solutions to our most pressing national problems. Today we honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all of the men and women who not only share his ideals, but act upon them daily. To paraphrase Dr. King, every person must decide whether to walk in the light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the principal of the GMC Prep School, Dr. Steve Greer.
Good afternoon. It's a great day to be an American, let me tell you. You know, I've got the privilege today to introduce our guest speaker, who I've grown fond of in a very short period of time. I read his amazing book, had a chance to listen to some of his stories last night at dinner, and then got to be his escort today. And I tell you, it has been a privilege, sir. Thank you very much. It's been an honor. He sent me this bio, and I said, "What do you want me to say?" He said, "I want you to say everything." I said, "Okay, I'll do it. This is an introduction." And it's amazing, okay? Some occupations are more demanding than others. Can you imagine the amount of time it would take to become an airline pilot or a qualified lawyer? Now consider doing both simultaneously while also building an award-winning business. Captain T has done just that. He founded the Summit Group companies, which owned fast food franchises, including Subway sandwiches, Dunkin' Donuts, TCBY yogurt shops, an engineering services firm, a systems integration company, and a real estate development firm. He also oversaw state aviation agencies for 4 governors in both Democratic and Republican administrations. He's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Black Enterprise magazine, and has appeared on NBC, CBS, PBS, and a plethora of other shows. Captain T has served on and chaired numerous business and nonprofit boards, more recently as past president and CEO of the Association of Graduates of the Air Force Academy, which represents 50,000 graduates. A magazine once wrote, "He seems to make attaining the American dream look easy." The dream is possible, he says, by following some simple principles and developing a commitment to do the best you can to live a life of excellence. Please join me in welcoming Captain William T. Thompson as he takes us on the Flight to Excellence, the title of his new book. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for that very warm welcome. To get a welcome like that shows me how generous you folks are, because I hadn't even done anything yet, and you're clapping like that. Thank you, Steve. Where'd you go? Thank you, Steve, for that amazing introduction. Were some of y'all impressed? Yeah, I was impressed. For a moment, I was wondering who the guest speaker was going to be. But despite that amazing introduction, let me be honest with you, folks. I'm just not, and I want to repeat, I'm not an amazing guy. You see, I wasn't born with any special gifts or any unique talents. And I'm certainly not the smartest person in the room. But I did get a gift from my parents. And I didn't realize it was a gift at the time. I could have thrown it away. I could have lost it. But luckily I didn't. And that gift was simply this: to live by the right principles in my life. And I've come to admire and respect other folks who've chosen, and it is a choice, to live by the right principles as well, one of which was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now today I'm going to take you on a flight, because as a former Air Force instructor pilot, and there's me back in my Top Gun days. Next slide. And as a former international airline captain for Delta, taking people on flights is just what I do. But today's flight's going to be a little different. So I'm going to take you on a flight back in time to when Dr. Martin Luther King, next slide, was still alive. Dr. King was a towering figure in the history of our country, having fundamentally changed who we were as a nation. And while we still have work to do, no question about that, as evidenced by the names that have become so familiar to us over the past few years, names like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and right here in our own backyard, Ahmaud Arbery, yet I can personally attest to how far we have come as a result of Dr. King's leadership of the civil rights movement. And one of the highlights of my own personal life was that I got to meet Dr. King in my hometown when I was just 13 years old. And that meeting, that encounter, would put me on a road that would fundamentally change my life. So I'd like to take you into my life for a little bit and have you understand, as best you can, some of the things that I had to deal with and what brought Dr. King to my hometown back when I was 13 years old. So I grew up in a small southern town, Orangeburg, South Carolina, back when segregation was still the law of the land, at least in the Deep South. It was at a time and in a place where opportunities for a young black guy like myself were few. And some of the things that you may have heard about or read about or maybe seen depicted in a movie, or maybe you've watched a documentary on TV, were just a part of my everyday life. So, for example, we had white-only and colored drinking fountains. We had white-only and colored restrooms. Black folks couldn't go to a restaurant and sit down and have a meal with white folks. And even an event like this would have been against the law. and everybody in here would have been subject to arrest for the crime of mixing the races. Schools were segregated. Athletic events were segregated. Even the movie theater was segregated. Now, we could go see the same movie at the same time, but white folks went through the main doors and sat on the main level. Black folks went through a side door, up the stairs, and watched the movie from the balcony. And as a young kid, I used to wonder why white folks thought that was a good idea. Because me and my buddies would go to the movie on Saturday afternoon, the Saturday matinee. We would sometimes throw popcorn and candy wrappers down on the white folks below. Yeah, immature, impolite, granted. But that was our small act of resistance to what was an unjust system. My parents took teaching jobs early in their career, and we moved to Georgetown, South Carolina. But we kept our home in Orangeburg, and we'd come home once or twice a month on the weekends and for holidays and vacations. And when we were traveling back and forth, and we'd stop at a gas station, my dad would go in and get the key to the restroom. Now, my dad is a light-skinned guy. Next slide. Next slide. And the one after that. There you go. So there's a picture of my mom and dad later on in their lives, but handsome couple, and both of them are my heroes. But anyway, he'd go in the gas station, and get the key to the restroom. And often they would give him the key to the white-only restroom. So we'd go in, we'd all do our duty in the white restroom. And then my mama would take the key back. And when she got in the car, she and my daddy would just laugh at the reaction on the gas attendant's face when he tried to figure out how this black woman had gotten the white-only restroom key. And that was their small act of resistance to an unfair system. Now, in 1960, that resistance just blew up, and Orangeburg became a hotbed of civil rights activity. And that was primarily for two reasons. Number one, by then, most black folks that were in the know had heard of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, which started when a little lady by the name of Rosa Parks wouldn't give up her seat to a white guy and go stand in the back of the bus. Mind you, she was sitting in the colored section. Well, for that, she got arrested. And people in Montgomery, black folks in Montgomery, protested by refusing to ride on the city bus system. That boycott effort was led by a young pastor who had just arrived in Montgomery, whose name was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And under his leadership and a federal lawsuit, Montgomery was forced to integrate the bus system. Second reason is that Orangeburg has two HBCUs, Claflin University and South Carolina State University. They're right next door to each other, only separated by a wrought iron gate, which is always open, so the kids can flow back and forth. Now, your normal small southern town tends to be parochial, right? And I use that term loosely to describe a town where a lot of people know each other. They tend to think alike. Sometimes they're set in their ways, and they don't travel a whole lot, so they're not exposed to outside influences. But Orangeburg wasn't like that. Because of the colleges, it was a little more sophisticated. And so, for example, you have some of the college professors who had gone away to big schools in other parts of the country to work on their advanced degrees, work on their masters or their PhDs. And those programs were generally integrated. And you had college kids coming in every year, mostly from the South, but some from other parts of the country, up north or maybe out west, where there was no segregation. And so in the college community, there was already resistance to segregation. And of course, the college has an influence on the surrounding African American community. And so by 1960, black folks in Orangeburg are pushing back hard on segregation. And I can remember my daddy taking me to the first major civil rights demonstration in Orangeburg. People were protesting against the white-only lunch counters at our two local 5 and dimes. How many of y'all know what a 5 and dime is? All right, a few. All right, for most of you kids that don't, the 5 and dime back then was like the dollar store today. And that's a lesson in inflation. What cost me a nickel is costing you $1. Now, the 5 and dime store also had a lunch counter where you could go in and buy food and sit down and eat. Now, black folks could shop over here on this side of the 5 and dime and buy stuff, but they couldn't come over on this side of the 5 and dime store and sit down and enjoy a meal. Well, we had a couple kids from Claflin University in South Carolina State that went down to both of the 5 and dime stores and sat down on the stools and ordered food. They call that a sit-in back in the day. And that was against the law. And the cops came, arrested them, and put them into jail. And that's what the big protest was all about. More than 1,000 people marching in the streets of Orangeburg, South Carolina. Well, the cops came out and said, y'all got to go home. This is an illegal assembly. And nobody listened. And they used tear gas and police dogs to try to disperse the crowd. Then the fire engines came out, and the firemen started hosing people and knocking them all down on the ground. And I can remember thinking, wow, I never knew a fire hose was so powerful. Well, they started arresting people. In fact, the history book will say that 388 people got arrested that day. Now, Daddy and I were not a part of the demonstration, but from where we were standing, we could see the whole thing unfold. That was March 15th, 1960, and I was just 8 years old. And from that point on, for the next 10 years, there was always some civil rights activity in Orangeburg. There were either protest marches or demonstrations or sit-ins or boycott, all leading up to what came to be known as the Orangeburg Massacre, which occurred on February 8th, 1968. 3 dead, 32 injured, 2 years before Kent State. And that's the environment that I grew up in my hometown. A couple years later, I was home for the weekend. Parents were, we were in Orangeburg from Georgetown. And I went over to my best friend's house to hang out. His name is James E. Sultan, Jr. Nickname is Waukee. Next slide. See if I can get a picture of my boy up. One more. There we go. We've been best friends since we were in kindergarten together at Christ the King Catholic School. We were hanging out in his room, and he got up and went over and closed the door. And he came back and sat next to me on the bed, and he started speaking real slow. He said, man, guess what Mo and I did last week? Mo was Maurice, our other best friend. He said, we went walking alongside the college kids who were protest marching. He said, and nobody said a thing. He said, we walked with them for a long time. We finally broke off when they were getting close to the police lines. He said, it was pretty cool. I said, wow, man, I was impressed. But then I got a little jealous because they had done something that I hadn't been able to do. He said, but don't worry. He said, I heard Daddy talking on the phone just last night, and the college kids are going to be marching again tomorrow. He said, we can go back over there and walk along beside them again. And I said, yes, I'm all in. Until I remembered that tomorrow was Sunday, and we always went back to Georgetown at 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. But I had an idea. I thought, well, let me go home and see if I can change that time frame. So I went home, I asked Mom and Dad, I said, hey, can we go back to Georgetown a little later on today? And Daddy said, well, tell me what's going on. Tell me why. And I told him the truth. I didn't lie. Now, my parents are very understanding folks. So they understandably said, no, we're not going to have you march down with a bunch of college kids and demonstrate. And he said, that's too dangerous and you're too young. He said, we're all going to be back in Georgetown so we can go to school on Monday morning. Well, I was disappointed, but I thought lodged in my mind that next time I went home with my boys and they were marching again, I was going to march with them the next time. So we moved back to Orangeburg at the end of that school year. And I was back with my boys in Christ the King School again. And we'd all walk home together after school. And we'd always cut through the colleges on the way home. Because Christ the King School was here. The colleges were both here, and where we live was over here. So that was a direct line to get home. Well, we're walking home one day, and there's a whole lot of activity going on. A whole lot of people out in front of the dorms. And Walkie said, man, I think they're going to march again. And Mo said, yeah, but we can't walk along with them because we got to be home. And I said, yeah, we got to be home, but we can take 5 minutes and go over there and get a little closer just to see what's going on. And that's what we did. And the kids were about to march again. There were some guys out front giving speeches and telling everybody what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. Then there were some college girls over on some picnic tables making protest signs. Well, I noticed a couple of those college girls were pretty cute. One of them was particularly fine. So I kind of drifted over that way so I could get a better look. So she was making her sign, and it said, we have waited long enough. And she put it in quotation marks for some reason. And then she picked it up to kind of admire her work, right? And then she looked over at me, caught me looking at her. And I got embarrassed that I had got caught staring at her. And she said, well, aren't you a cute young thing? And I was like, oh, my God, I didn't know what to say. but I knew that I had been smitten right away. And then she said, here, sweetie, you can march with this one. And I'm thinking, march? I can't march. I got to go home. But she'd call me sweetie. And with that pretty face and that big smile, I couldn't say no. And just like that, I was in my first civil rights march. I grabbed that sign and I held it high in pride, and we marched downtown, and we all got arrested. There were so many of us that they had several different lines to protest us, to book us. I finally got to the front of my line, and the policeman was there writing fast. And he said, full legal name. And I said, William Lamont Thompson. He's writing it down. He said, date of birth. I said, June 14th, 1951. He's writing it down. Then he stopped, and he looked up at me for the first time. He said, you're 12 years old? I said, yes, sir, but I'll be 13 in June. He kind of rolled his eyes. He said, what's your phone number? I said, 534-3156. He wrote that down. Then he pointed to a chair over against the wall. He said, go over there and sit down. And I did what I was told. He called my daddy. You guys know what a rotary phone is? He dialed that rotary number. Mr. Thompson, you got a boy that's 12 years old named William? I didn't hear what my daddy said, but obviously he said yes. He said, come down here to Orangeburg Police Station and pick him up. Then he hung up the phone. And about 45 minutes later, because Daddy had to wade through all the stuff that was going on, he finally got there, picked me up, and took me home. Next day in the newspaper, it said that 1,033 protesters, mostly college kids, had been arrested. But in the Thompson family, we knew that the real number was 1,034 because I'd gotten arrested, but I didn't have to go to jail. Now, Walkie's dad, Mr. James Sultan Sr., was a prominent black businessman in Orangeburg. He owned the Esso service station down on the corner. The company would later change its name to Exxon, which is what you're probably familiar with today. Next slide, maybe two. Let's see. Get Mr. Sultan up there. There he is. Mr. Sultan was also the treasurer for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So he knew everything that was going on in Orangeburg. One of his duties was to raise money to bail people out of jail and to pay the fines. Well, by this time, the movement in Orangeburg had been going on for 4 years. And people are getting weary. They're getting tired of getting arrested and going to jail. They're frustrated at the lack of progress. And it was getting harder for him to raise money. He knew that the movement needed a shot in the arm. And it came in the person of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. coming to town. Next slide. Dr. King had several months prior given his now famous I Have a Dream speech on the Washington Monument. And when word got around that Dr. King was coming to town, that injected new life into the movement and new excitement around Orangeburg. Next slide. Walkie and I were in the backyard playing baseball. And Mr. Sultan came to the back door and called him in. I had to go to the bathroom, so I went in too. As we walked in the house, there was a man sitting on the couch in the back den. Mr. Sultan said, "Boys, come on in here. Let me introduce you to Dr. Martin Luther King." And folks, it was an oh my God moment. We went in there and shook his hand, sat down and talked for a while. He asked us how we were doing, what was going on in our lives. And we told him as best we could. He asked us how we were doing in school. And we were both doing pretty good. And he liked that. He told us to keep studying hard. He told us whenever we were doing whatever we were doing, to keep working hard. He told us that we had a responsibility, a special obligation as the potential leaders of the next generation. And folks, having a conversation with Dr. Martin Luther King was just an incredible conversation. Next slide. So there is Dr. King. There's Dr. King. There's Mr. Sultan as a much younger man. And on the right side of him, left side of him, is Mr. Blythewood. He owned the local funeral home in Orangeburg. And so it was in that room that Walkie and I met Dr. Martin Luther King. Well, that afternoon, after he left Mr. Sultan's, he went up to Claflin University for a campus visit. Now you can go to the next slide. And that's a picture of him at Claflin with some students and administrators. That night he spoke at the Trinity Methodist Church, which is right across the street from both of the colleges. Standing room only. And he gave a moving and inspiring and uplifting speech that had everybody in the church on their feet. He said that these were dark days, but it was often darkest just before the dawn. He said that he knew the times were tough, but we would ultimately prevail because our cause was righteous and just. And as I looked at Dr. King up the pulpit, I couldn't help but think about the fact that I had been talking to him just a couple hours before, one-on-one. Well, actually, two-on-one, because of me and Walkie. And I vowed that very night that I would, in his words, become a foot soldier in the fight for freedom and justice. And I signed up to become a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, the Teenage Division. Now, SCLC had a program called SCOPE. And when I became 14, just a few months later, I was able to get my restricted driver's license in South Carolina, which meant that I could drive from 6 in the morning until 6 at night by myself. SCOPE was the voter registration program. And that program consisted of white kids from major universities all across the country, giving up their summer, coming down south and working with local volunteers like myself, in registering black folks to vote. I got teamed up with a guy named Will from the University of Michigan, and we hit it off right away. First of all, we had the same first name. He was William and I was William. Will was also an Eagle Scout, and I was a Boy Scout at the time, working toward and hoping to be an Eagle Scout one day. And Will had a car, and I had a new driver's license. And he would ride shotgun and read the map, and I would drive. And drive we did all over the dusty dirt roads in the country of Orangeburg County, knocking on people's doors and asking them that they want to register to vote. There were only 2 days that you could register in Orangeburg that summer, August 2nd and August 3rd, down at the county courthouse. We had sample voter registration forms, and we'd show people how to fill them out, what boxes to check, where to sign their name, and in some cases, where to make their X. We told them if they needed a ride, we'd provide transportation. That if they needed somebody to watch the kids, we'd provide a babysitter. We were going to do everything we could to help them exercise their constitutional right to vote. Well, the first day, August 3rd, there were a line of folks out of the courthouse and around the block, and we registered over 500 people. Second day, line of people out of the courthouse and around the block. But apparently on day one, because of our success, we'd shaken up the white power structure. Because on day one, they'd had 3 registrars there, which was what they were supposed to have. But on day 2, they only had 1. One guy had called in sick. The other guy had a cow stuck in the ditch. So 1 was going to be the number for the full day. And I thought, my daddy used to say this, don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining. We knew this was straight up voter suppression. Well, 5 o'clock came. County clerk came out and said, that's it. Voting's over. And there were still a lot of people in the line. And then he said, better luck trying to vote next time. And the way he said it just hit a visceral nerve. Everybody knew what had happened was so unfair. Most people left, but a few people stayed. And they and us, the Scope volunteers, we marched down the hall of that courthouse to the main courtroom, and we staged an impromptu sit-in. Well, the clerk came down about a half hour later and said, y'all all got to go. You're trespassing on government property. And if you don't leave right now, you're all going to jail because I've already called the police. Well, courtroom had a door in the back that led out to an outside balcony. So I went back there and went outside to see if anything was going on. And there were police cars coming from everywhere. There was Orangeburg City Police. There was the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Department, South Carolina Highway Patrol, all merging in on the courthouse. And by chance, I happened to see my grandmother walking on the sidewalk on the other side of the street. She worked as a housekeeper for a white doctor in his family, and she was on her way home after work. So I yelled down, Grandma, Grandma, and she heard me, so she was looking around. I said, I'm up here at the courthouse. And she saw me, and she said, boy, what you doing up there? I said, I'm going to jail. I said, when you get home, call Mama and Daddy and tell them I won't be home tonight. Then I waved goodbye, and I went back inside. Well, about 20 minutes later, the cops came in. They gave us one more chance. Joe, our Scope leader, said, we're not leaving until you register these people to vote. And they started arresting us. And we all went limp, which was Dr. King's nonviolent resistance technique. So they had to take us out by our hands and our feet. And I got to be honest with you, the white kids got treated worse than we did. Because some of them got stomped and kicked, and a couple of them got beat with the billy club stick. See, they were the outside agitators coming down here and stirring up our good colored folks. And they took us all to jail. Next day, sheriff's deputies came in and got 5 of us and marched us back down to the courthouse, which was about a block and a half away. 54 had gotten arrested, by the way, according to the paper the next day. So they took us down to the courthouse, took us up to the judge's chambers, where our parents were waiting inside. You see, we were the 5 that were under 18. So the judge said he was going to release us into the custody of our parents, that if we kept our nose clean and didn't get in trouble again, he would wipe our arrest record clean. As we were leaving the courthouse, Daddy put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Son, I guess this time you really are jailbird." First time I'd gotten arrested, but I hadn't gone to jail. He said, "But I'm proud of what you're doing." And we went home. Now, a month later, I joined 12 other African-American kids who were integrating what had been all white, Orangeburg High. And folks, I will never forget my first day of high school. You see, there were only 2 high schools in my hometown. There was Wilkerson High School, the black high school, which was 1 block up and 2 blocks over from where I lived. And then there was the much nicer Orangeburg High School, or white high school. But it was over on the other side of town, and we were going to have to be bused to get over there. Well, I left home on the first day of school. I went down to the end of my street to wait for that bus. I was by myself because I was the only kid in my neighborhood. The adults would say courageous enough, but my buddies would say crazy enough to go to Orangeburg High. Well, after waiting for a few minutes, I looked off in the distance, and I saw several police cars with their lights flashing, headed in my direction. I thought, wow, there must be a big accident on up the road. Kids, imagine my shock when that caravan of police cars and the school bus stopped right in front of me. This was my federal marshal and state trooper escort on my first day of high school. Well, I got on the bus. We picked up a few more kids, and then we headed on over to Orangeburg High. I'm sitting there saying, man, this is so cool to have a police escort just to go to high school. I didn't know the white kids had it so good. We rode for about 15 minutes, and as we came around a curve, Orangeburg High came into view. We took a right turn into the school parking lot, and our official welcoming committee was there to greet us. A baseball bat, axe handle wielding, angry mob who rushed up and began to pound on the side of the bus before the cops had come in and push them all back. And they were yelling and screaming obscenities and racial slurs and telling us that we didn't belong over here, that we should turn around and go back to our own side of town. As we got off the bus and walked down through these 2 lines of screaming humanity, being threatened, being called names, and being spat upon, got to tell you, folks, turning around and getting back on that bus seemed to be the smart thing to do. You would think that it might have been the easier thing to do, but it wouldn't have been in keeping with the core principles that my mom and dad, Willie and Pearl, had taught me. Next slide. Get them back up there again. And so we didn't turn around and get back on that bus. And because of those ingrained core principles, I couldn't turn around and get back on that bus. And that was day 1 of 4 of the toughest, most turbulent, but in many respects the most enlightening 4 years of my life. Why am I telling you that story about my first half hour of my first day of school? Simply because of this. We all have to deal with fear, and we all have to deal with challenges at some point in our lives. In my case, it was as a 14-year-old kid. But here's the takeaway. You can't let the turbulence of life keep you from achieving excellence in your life. And that's the gift that I got from my parents, which was reinforced in my conversation with Dr. King. See, Dr. King and my parents had the same definition of excellence. Simply doing the very best you can each and every time, no matter what it is you're called to do. And Dr. King's got a quote on that subject that is right on point. He said, if you're called to be a street sweeper, you should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or as Beethoven composed music, or as Shakespeare wrote poetry. He says, you should sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth shall pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. My daddy used to say, son, success in life is seldom the result of natural gifts or talents. As a school teacher, he had 2 master's degrees, yet he'd say, it's not even about educational level and more than average intelligence, but it is about your commitment to excellence. He said, William, if you do your best, you're going to do better than most, even people more talented than you, because most people aren't going to give you their best. Most people aren't committed to excellence. And over time, sadly, I found that to be true. But following my daddy's simple principle has worked for me over and over again. But the point is, I guarantee you it'll work for each and every one of you, too. So my time is up. We're going to land this airplane, but let me leave you with this postscript. I became an Eagle Scout like my buddy from Michigan, Will. I earned a National Merit Commendation for academics. I was All-American honorable mention in football and received AAU recognition in track. And with that resume, I got appointments to the 2 service academies that I applied to. Coast Guard Academy up in Connecticut and the Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs. And I share that information with you not to brag or to boast or to impress you, but rather to impress upon you these very simple facts. That you don't have to be born with any special gifts or talents. And you don't need to be the smartest person in the room. And even when you're facing fear or significant challenges in your life, that you can always choose, because it's a choice, to live by the right values. And you can choose to have excellence in your life. And that's the message that I got from Dr. King that inspired me so much. It's the message that I leave you with today as we celebrate what would have been Dr. Martin Luther King's 93rd birthday. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I am Captain T.
Ladies and gentlemen, Cadet Lieutenant Colonel Lauren Rutherford, our Cadet Battalion Commander, and Cadet Command Sergeant Major Maya Hall, our Cadet CSM, along with President Caldwell and Chairman of the GMC Board of Trustees, Mr. George Hogan, will present a Georgia Military College saber to Captain William T. Thompson in honor of his visit here today.
Right, there we go. Got it? Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, man. Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand as Cadet Maya Hall recites our cadet prayer.
Please bow your heads. Almighty God, General of all life's forces, Commander of nature, we praise thy holy name. Visit thy presence upon us and all former GMC cadets, reinforcing us in our quest for knowledge, integrity, and leadership, instilling in us humanitarianism, and bless our enemy, whoever he might be. Extinguish from our daily lives greed and envy, and make us champions of right and ladies and gentlemen of honor. May we glorify thy name of victory and be courageous in defeat. Help us ever to think first of our comrades, and secondly of ourselves, and always of thee. Guide our footsteps and cleanse our minds. May we be first in the service of our country and first in thy service. Lead us, O Lord, that we might lead. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker, William T. Thompson, will be available down front for a short time if anyone in the audience would like to come forward to meet him. This concludes today's ceremony. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.